They say not to make your book too long, or people won't spend the money and buy it. As a real quick introduction to this video, if you weren't already aware, as the little intro thing says, I am Joanna Holden, and I am a Christian author of fantasy, as well as being an author tuber here on YouTube. Normally my videos, though all kind of focused on fantasy and series, tend to be more in the how-to range or in vlogging. I don't often just sit down and ramble, but I honestly enjoy hearing the thoughts and thought processes of other writers about different struggles that they face as writers that I also face. And so today's video is going to be one of those kinds of videos. It's going to be a rambly talk, a tea time talk, except I don't have any tea because it's Texas and it's like blistering hot outside in June. So we'll just say that this is going to be my rambly talk for the month. So my daughter, my 4-year-old, and her 8-year-old cousin have been sitting outside the door just listening because they're bored. Oh, to have the freedom and time to be bored. I would have so many books written if I had time to be bored. Okay, so I don't know about you, but as a fantasy writer, I find myself constantly plagued with the need to shorten my stories, like shorten the amount of words that I've used. And when I took those videos this morning, I was just walking through the bookstore. I'm pretty sure I have not read any of the books that I picked up. Shocker, I know. We've talked about this before. I think I really don't read a lot of fantasy because I am so specific in what I like in fantasy, which is why I write it. That's actually why I write it, is because I have not been able to find much fantasy that I enjoy outside of the stories that I actually pen myself, which is kind of sad. But anyways, point being that people really do, like, one of the biggest piece of advice you get from people as far as like word count and how big your book should be is, don't make your book too big, even if it's fantasy, because then people won't buy it, and if nobody's gonna buy this humongous thick book, that's just way too many pages. People don't do that anymore. But then I was walking down this aisle of this bookstore, and all of these humongous fantasy books were just sitting on the shelves, and I know that like one of the first things you could say is that oh, they were by, the big 5 publishing companies, or, they were by a well-known author, or they were the last book in the series. Although, honestly, like, the Cassandra Clare ones are all, like, that big. This is something I have genuinely struggled with, because let me show you the first book that I ever, like, really finished that was a fantasy. I'm gonna see if I can do it without knocking everything else over. Okay. So this, remember I talked about this beast right here? Okay, so this is what that turned into when I like wrote. This is huge. This is huge. This is, let's see here. So this is 329 pages at the 7 by 10, I want to say, from CreateSpace. What it was at the time, CreateSpace. Now it's KDP. So that's what this my first ever completed book was, just over 100,000 words long. And it was a big book for me at the time. Now, since then, I have had an even bigger problem with keeping my books short. And I am an overwriter. You all know this. We all know this. I did an entire video on being an overwriter. So usually my first drafts end up being way longer than the original, or like not the original, but the printed product. Like even in Snow Dust, I've been editing that. I'm almost to the end now, and it's already gone from being 44,000 words to almost 34,000 words. And that's a middle school fairy tale retelling, so it was already pretty small to start with. So I recognize that a big part of my problem is the fact that I'm an overwriter. I have these amazing stories, and I want to write them in their fullness. I want to write them complete, like they are in my head. And so in case you're a newbie to writing fantasy, which I feel like I should write or do an entire series of videos for newbies to writing fantasy, because it is a little bit more complicated than it looks from a distance. But in case you're a newbie, I've done a bit of research on like word counts and page counts and how long these books are supposed to be in fantasy and in different subgenres and in different target audiences. The nice thing about writing in fantasy and having this overwriter problem is that in general with fantasy you have a little bit more wiggle room as far as word count goes. In fact, like I've seen like that, oh, don't make it longer than about 100,000 words put out there for fantasy. But then I was researching publishing houses at one point, and there was one publishing house that said that they wouldn't even accept fantasy manuscripts for general fiction unless they were a minimum of 100,000 words. That was pretty amazing. I just like felt the weight lifted up off my shoulders. So the question is, that's being asked by me in this video, how long should a general fiction fantasy novel epic be? Should I be worried about it? And how much can I get away with? That's kind of what I'm asking for. I think there's a couple things to consider. The first is that in general with fantasy, particularly like high fantasy, you're gonna have a couple, like a lot actually, honestly, a lot of extra room to write because people expect fantasy to be longer. They're expecting a journey, a saga, an epic. So I believe personally it is more than okay to go a little bit farther than the average book in that target audience for age. And we saw this in those video clips that I showed you. Like I said, all of those were fantasy novels. All of those are like, people are buying them. People are spending $25 for a giant hardcover edition of these books. And not that, you know, as a debut indie author, I'm expecting that of people, but just to recognize that does happen and that it's not really that uncommon for fantasy books to be huge. And actually, all the books that I showed were YA. Like, we did not even get into the adult, like the general fiction ones that are like this big. I kid you not. I picked up one book, and for some reason it was only like this tall. Like, it was a very short book, but it was like as wide as my face, almost. I was like, seriously, what the heck are you doing? Just like make it a little taller, and it'll slim down a little. It'll be a little easier to work with, I would imagine. Anyways, I don't know for sure, but just knowing that people do read bigger books. So that would be my first piece of encouragement to you. Just being able to walk down those aisles and see how big some of the books were and how many pages, I mean pages upon pages upon pages. And in some cases, like really slow material too, like slow burner material was being introduced in these books. Something else that's really important to consider when deciding how long your book needs to be, and you kind of saw this a little bit in those video clips, is that if you are ending the series, if you are coming toward the end of the series, I think people give you even way more leniency for how thick your book can be. If you have spent, 3, 4, even 5 books building up a series, building up all these characters, building up all these subplots, building up all of these different threads that are now coming down to one final book, then I think that you should have a ton of flexibility with yourself and expect people to be a little bit more lenient with how big your book is going to be. Because you are trying to cram so much story into one book. Or, I mean, even if you pull Hollywood, split it in 2, you're still trying to cram a lot of story into a small amount of pages. So give yourself, I've been working toward just really giving myself grace with this. But then what do you do if you do need to whittle down your book and you can't really get rid of any more wordage? You can't cut out any of the events because they're all essential. You've gotten rid of anything that could be fluff. What do you do when you still have a book that you personally feel is too big? That, maybe you're not at the 125 mark anymore. Maybe you're at the 175 mark, and it's the first book in the series, and then you're a debut author, and you're like, wow, yeah, nobody's going to pick up this much book from a debut author they've never heard of. For the first book in a series. That is a little bit too big and too much to ask of people. So what do I do with that? Well, there are a couple things that make it a little bit easier. One of the first things that comes to mind, obviously, is just split the book in half, right? That's what a lot of people actually would probably tell you. Just split the book in half, and then you have 2 books. That does work, and a lot of times splitting in half is the easiest form because with a midpoint, if you have a definitive midpoint, then you kind of have a climax that you could work with. You could take the emotion from that midpoint, and the action leading up to it and really create a substantial climax with it. It'll take some reworking, maybe add a few scenes, maybe delete a few scenes, whatever, but it works pretty well when you already have that defined center and it's easy to just split the books in two. However, this does not always work. So you can maybe consider moving parts of the end of the book. Maybe the last act of the book could be the beginning of the next book, and instead you have you create a new climax for the end of this book. Maybe a less resolvable is that a word? A climax that is less easy to resolve, but that leads with a lot of anticipation into the next book. If you really are concerned about how long your book is, and you don't know whether to cut it or to leave it as is, I would just ask a friend. Critique partners are incredible resources for just telling you how long if they're sitting down and they're reading your book, right? They're incredible resources for saying, okay, this book is definitely dragging. Either cut out some of this stuff here and make it shorter, or amp up what's happening here so you can maintain the length. Or they're really good at saying, you know what, actually this felt perfectly paced, or with saying, yeah, this definitely needs to be a two-parter here. You could also do this if you don't have as many critique partners as you would like, or you're still unsure about it. Do this when you beta read. Ask people who are beta reading for you, say, hey, what do you think about the length of this book? Given the genre, given the amount of story that's going on, given all the twists and turns, and the big battle sequence at the end, how do you feel about the length of this novel? And if they're being good beta readers, which we all hope that they are, then they'll tell you their honest opinion, and then you can kind of take the overall number of people that you have had read for you and do a simple poll and just kind of see where the numbers lay, and then you can kind of go from there. Sometimes it is important to listen to your own heart. Sometimes it is important to listen to the readers. Sometimes you just have to go with what works better for them, because ultimately, you do want to be able to sell this. I talk a big game about, I've just quit worrying about it, and I'm just not gonna, but at the same time, I'm like, if 90% of my readers, my beta readers, told me that the book was just too long and that they didn't think that they would probably spend money on a book this long, then I would definitely consider cutting it down, because ultimately I want people to be reading my book. Money or not, I want people to be reading my book. And if people are not going to pick up this book because of the length, then I need to cut it down. However, again, it's like a balance thing. I don't think I should be afraid of making it as long as I feel it needs to be, just because, people might not read it. So that would be my ultimate test. And I am looking forward to getting to do this with some of my bigger projects. I've done it in the past, like with critique partners, asked them if the book was too long, and usually it wasn't, and I was just kind of up in my head about it. But just ask people. That is the best way if you don't know and you want to, really make sure that you're being good to your readers, especially if you're hoping to build up a fan following. Then just ask your readers, ask your critique partners, ask your beta readers. Okay, we made it through this video. I don't know if you could tell from the amounts of cuts, but this video took an awful lot of filming to make. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a like, and consider subscribing on the way out. I post fantasy and series-related writerly videos every Saturday, and a lot of times I end up posting vlogs, because I am a mommy author, full-time stay-at-home mom, and writer of... So I want to encourage others who are in the same position. So if you are in that position, then be sure to subscribe so you can get ongoing encouragement and inspiration. As always, all the stuff you could ever need to know about me is in the description box below. My social media accounts, my website, etc., etc., etc. And I hope you have an amazing rest of the weekend writing. I know I plan to. I will see you all in my next video. Bye.